Hello and welcome to the sixth episode of the Flexibility Focus podcast. I haven't done an installment of the show in a little while because I've been busy running the Master Flexibility Trainer course, which has been hugely successful, but which takes up pretty much all of my time. However, I'm beyond excited to bring an exclusive conversation that I had with one of the true research greats, Dr. David Behm, Professor at the School of Human Kinetics and Recreation at Memorial University of Newfoundland in Canada, and author of The Science and Physiology of Flexibility and Stretching. People ask me all the time what resources they should read to get a bird's eye view of the current literature when it comes to flexibility and stretching. And if you follow me at all on Instagram, my handle is @flexibility.research, you'll know that I'm always recommending Dave's book. It is a fantastic resource and is probably the best science-based book on stretching and flexibility, which has been published for nearly 20 years. I also recommend it as a resource for people who sign up to the Master Flexibility Trainer course. And by the way, if you want to know more about the course, then visit www.flexibilityresearch.com or send me an email at dan@flexibilityresearch.com for more information. I cannot tell you how much of a joy it was to talk with Dave about his research and ask him his thoughts on where the science currently is and where it should be directed in the future. Dave has been a prolific researcher, authoring over 300 peer-reviewed articles and being cited more than 21,000 times. Our knowledge has really been improved by this man's work. My sincerest thanks go to Dave for giving his time and energy to share his insights with you, the audience of this show. If you're listening to this episode on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you get your podcasts, you can also watch the video version of the episode on YouTube. Please enjoy. So, Dave, thank you so much for being so willing to take part in an interview for the Flexibility Focus podcast. For the regular listeners, you'll be well known because your work is constantly being cited. Obviously, you've published extensively in the field of human physiology, doing work on subjects such as fatigue and muscle activity. But like I said, members of the audience will undoubtedly be more familiar with your work in stretching and flexibility. How did you become involved in conducting flexibility-related research? And is there a particular subject that you prefer to research compared to other areas that you've studied?
Sure. Well, it all started back when I was a unsuccessful athlete. Back in the 1970s, I played a lot of North American football or Canadian football. There's a slight difference between Canadian and American football, but pretty close to being the same sport. I played ice hockey and baseball, and I ended up going from university football to being drafted in the Canadian Football League, which is our professional league. But I didn't make it. I was only in the league for about 1 month. And so I never made it to the Football Hall of Fame, never made a whole bunch of money. And one of my big problems was that I didn't have blazing speed. I would call myself a tweener. I was 5'11" or about 180 centimeters and 205 pounds, so about 97 kilograms, I guess. And I had the speed of a fullback who is normally like 230 pounds. Right. So I needed to be a lot faster. And one of the things they told me back then was that doing flexibility, I could decrease the resistance to movement. I could get a greater stride length. I wouldn't have to fight against my muscles as much, and I could get faster. So I did a lot of work on my flexibility, and it really didn't do too much for my speed. So that's what I was taught back in the 70s and 80s. And then around 1998 to 2000, some articles started coming out, primarily one by Jonathan Fowles, who is now at Acadia University in Nova Scotia in Canada, and my previous supervisor, Digby Sale. And they found that there was impairments with stretching. And so that was totally against what I had been previously taught. And so it really piqued my interest, and I wanted to jump on the bandwagon and see what I could find in that area.
Fantastic. So what have been some of the most interesting findings that you've made during your career in research?
In stretching or overall?
Well, in stretching and overall. If you could answer both, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Well, in stretching, since we're on the topic, I, one of the things about science that confuses people is that unlike doctrines, sometimes we find out that we're not exactly correct, and science is always trying to improve upon what we know. So back in 2000, when I saw that Fallows and Sale article and it said stretching impairs performance, and I started doing that kind of research as well as others, I also found that stretching impaired performance. Mm-hmm. But over the years, that was 20 years ago, but over the years, I came to realize that the type of protocols that we're using were not real life protocols. Mm-hmm. So Fallows and Sale, they did 30 minutes of stretching of the plantar flexors of the calves. Well, nobody stretches their calves for 30 minutes. So of course you'd expect to have impairments if you spend a half hour stretching your calves. Yeah. So I wasn't much better because I thought, well, I'm going to be a little better than them. I'm going to stretch the quadriceps, so I do something different. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to stretch the quadriceps for 20 minutes. Yeah. Well, again, nobody stretches your quadriceps for 20 minutes. And so we went down this road for years, and most of the researchers in this area have looked at stretching protocols that are not realistic. Mm-hmm. Like there's a series of articles by a guy named Eben and Simmons, and they found out that it's a cross-sectional or survey type of studies. And they found out that professional athletes on average stretch their muscles for 12 to 30 seconds. So over the years, I found out that if we did it for less than 60 seconds, then you're probably going to have trivial changes in your performance. And then when we started adding the proper warm-up, so you do an aerobic activity, you do some static stretching, less than 60 seconds per muscle group, you do some dynamic stretching, then you do your dynamic activities. So if you're a basketball player, you're doing jump shots, etc. Yeah. There's basically no impairments. Mm. So I kind of like the fact that I don't like the fact being wrong, but I like the fact that I went from one side of the stretching argument back 20 years ago, and now I know that what I was doing wasn't realistic, and I'm providing the public with the proper knowledge. Yeah. And yes, stretching can be impaired, can impair your performance only if you do it wrong. Yeah. Right. So that was a big thing over the last 20 years that I think I've accomplished. And in terms of other kind of research, well, I think some people might know me for one of my first articles, which was back in 1993. And that was the article that I did with Digby Sale on velocity specificity. And in that one, back in the 80s, when they talked about velocity specificity, it had to do with how fast you train. So if you want to get power and speed and be able to transfer force at a high velocity, then you got to train at high velocities. And then we asked the question, well, do you really need to train at high velocities, or is it the intent to contract explosively? And so what we found was that in our experiment, we had one foot that didn't move at all, so it was isometric, and one foot that trained at a high speed. But in both cases, the person would contract explosively. And what we found was that both ankles, we were doing the dorsiflexors, attained strength at high speeds. So it was the signal coming from the brain that was more important. It wasn't as important how fast the ankles actually had to move. So that was and that's been highly cited for the last, well, my God, that's almost 30 years now that's been hanging around, and people are still citing that piece of research. Yeah. And I'd say one last thing is now we're getting into, I've done a lot of work on fatigue, and we've been doing a lot of work on non-local fatigue. So if I fatigue my right arm, my left arm gets tired. Mm-hmm. But we've also found if I stretch my right arm, my left shoulder has more flexibility. So that's been a kind of interesting thing to find as well. So yeah, there's been a lot of interesting things over the last 25 years, but I'll say those are kind of 3 or 4 really interesting things that I'd point out. Yeah, and that last point about the kind of contralateral increase in flexibility takes me on to my next question quite nicely. Generally, we consider flexibility to be specific to a particular joint and joint action, but you recently published a systematic review and meta-analysis of how unilateral stretching can facilitate improvements in range of motion
in other areas of the body not subjected to the stretch. Could you talk a little bit about that study and what you think might be some of the mechanisms responsible for those changes in range of motion?
Yeah, sure. So we've done a number of individual studies, and as you said, we came out with this meta-analysis. The meta-analysis found that when you stretch one side, other muscles typically have either a small to moderate magnitude increase in range of motion. So some of our individual studies, we would stretch one hamstrings and the other hamstrings would have a greater flexibility. In another study, we stretched the groin area, the adductors, and the shoulders became more flexible or had a greater range of motion. And then we stretched the shoulders and the hamstrings became more flexible. So obviously that can't be morphological changes. We're not changing anything in the muscle or the tendon. So it's got to be something global. The first thing that comes to mind is the stretch tolerance. So, you know, if I'm going to stretch anything, any muscle, many people will go to a point of discomfort. So a point of discomfort is going to be a bit of pain and discomfort. When your body starts to feel pain, there's a fight or flight mechanism. And so you want to get away from that. And when you have a fight or flight mechanism, then you start to tense up and get excited so that you can run away from the tiger or the lion that's going to attack you. But what will happen is if you hold that stretch for a prolonged period of time, and typically it's recommended you hold it for 30 seconds or more to get an increased range of motion, then that discomfort, you get accustomed to that discomfort. Now, psychologically, you can get accustomed, and I'll talk in a bit more detail later about pain modulatory systems. But if we get accustomed to that, then we realize that, you know, there's no lion or tiger that's going to attack me. Therefore, I really don't need a fight or flight mechanism. So that increased sympathetic response I got for fight or flight decreases, parasympathetic takes over, I get more relaxed, and I can stretch a more relaxed muscle farther. But the sympathetic and the parasympathetic systems are global systems. They just don't go down to the muscle that you're stretching and say, hey, let's relax that muscle. When you have a parasympathetic response, the whole body relaxes. And so the decrease in that fight or flight, I think, would help to relax the whole body and get you to have an increased range of motion throughout. Then again, when you're going to the point of pain, you have these what are called pain modulatory systems. And you've heard probably of the gate control theory of pain. And then there's also what's called the diffuse noxious inhibitory control theory. So the gate control theory says that, well, if you are sending pain signals up, they travel by a slow nerve system, afferent system, type 3 and 4. But when you, let's say, rub your skin or stretch your muscles, you have fast conducting nerves, type 1s and type 2s. And the gate control theory says, well, those faster ones are going to go up and partially block that signal. And that's the kind of the old theory. And the newer theory says, well, also those type 1s and 2s make it to your brain, and then that sends down inhibitory signals to block it as well. So there's both a peripheral and a central kind of blocking or gating of that. So that would help to block most pain signals, not just from the muscle that you're stretching. And then there's this diffuse noxious inhibitory control. That's a mouthful, but it's kind of like pain relieves pain. So imagine if you're walking along and you banged your toe against the door. Well, after you stop swearing, how could you decrease the pain? Well, you could go over and you could hit your head on the door. And when you hit your head on the door, you wouldn't think about your toe as much. So what you're doing is that you're sending more pain signals up to your brain, and they converge on this area in the midbrain. And when they converge on this area in the midbrain releases endorphins and enkephalins. And as you probably know, endorphins are like morphine. So this kind of morphine substance travels through the body, through the cardiovascular system. And of course, it just doesn't go to the area that's hurting or the area that's under discomfort, like you're stretching. It will go throughout the body, and other parts of your body will get a kind of an analgesic effect. So once again, if you go on the other side and start stretching, if originally you felt a bit of pain at a certain range of motion, because you've got endorphins running, you're not going to feel as much pain. Maybe again, you'll be able to go a little further. So I think those are the two main mechanisms involved in allowing us to have an increased range of motion in other body parts.
Yeah, fantastic. Really interesting. It really is. Obviously, talking about stretch tolerance, that seems to have been the kind of main mechanism behind adaptations to stretching that has been put forward in recent years. But we've also had some research by Sandros Freitas, I'm hoping I'm pronouncing the surnames correctly, and Pedro Milhomens in 2015, and I think there was a study in 2017 by Simpson, which demonstrated some changes in muscle fiber architecture following several weeks of stretching. Where do you think the balance of evidence currently stands between the claims that stretching is only neurological, or that there can be change, like morphological changes in the tissues too? Where do you think we stand with that, and where do you think the future directions might go?
Yeah. Well, I think that when you read the literature, you get the impression that neuro is a lot stronger, and or psychological, like stretch tolerance, is a lot stronger than the morphological. I think part of that is that you need more expensive equipment to measure morphological. You need probably ultrasounds, maybe an MRI if you really want to get fancy. For neurological, you can strap on some EMG electrodes, which are cheap. So a lot of people do EMG studies and talk about the neurological. I think there's a balance between both. And so, of course, you will have neurological, you'll have a reflex attenuation. So those stretch reflexes will get less strong, and you won't have as tight or active a muscle. But on the other hand, when we're stretching, whether it's our tendon or our muscles, there's a lot of sliding going on there. And so there's sliding between the muscle and the fascicles and the extracellular portions. In the tendon, you've got sliding between the collagen fibers. And so oftentimes when a person is either does an excessive amount of activity or is sedentary, you'll get some cross linkages. So the proteins that are like collagen and elastin and fibronectin and all those proteins, they'll start to collide with each other. So they'll start to cross link and they won't move very well. Mm-hmm. And with the stretching, we can facilitate that movement. And so the fascicles will be able to translate better or slide better. Fascicles also rotate and change their angles when you're stretching. And so I think there's a lot of that going on. We talked in our latest review about the role of titin, which is a protein that holds the myofilaments to the Z line, and that is a very elastic protein. I'm not sure if we actually see changes in titin, but I think the main things that we'll see is that interrelationship between the proteins, the fascicles, the extracellular, and the muscle and the tendons. I think that's where we see more of our morphological changes.
Yeah, fantastic. Just before we finish, what do you think are some of the kind of big unanswered questions that you think should be the focus of research in the future? Well,
I'm leaning towards the intersection of psychology and physiology. Mm-hmm. So these psychophysiological changes, I think, are our future, because obviously when people talk about psychology, for some reason they think that it's somehow not related to your physiology. Mm-hmm. And obviously when you're angry, there's increased sympathetic responses. When you're sad, there's again increased sympathetic. If you breathe like in yoga, you can get more parasympathetic and start relaxing, or just start thinking of yourself on a beach and psychologically putting yourself in meditation. There's physiological changes. So one thing, for instance, that I'm doing right now, I'm in the midst of writing a review, and it's more of a call of action for people to do research in this area. If there is a bit of research out there. For example, if you watch a sad movie, at least in this one study, if you watch a sad movie and you did a hand grip strength test, you have less hand grip strength after the sad movie than if you watch a happy movie.
Wow.
So it's really interesting. Just watch a sad movie and become weaker. So I was thinking, my idea, and we're going to do this. In fact, we collected data, but unfortunately COVID shut us down for a while, so I have to get back to it. But what happens if you're an athlete and you're watching somebody exercise and they're getting tired? Will their fatigue affect you? Will you start to get tired watching somebody else get tired. And in fact, we did collect a bit of data on this, but it was only 4 or 5 subjects. We couldn't do a real ANOVA or statistical test on it, but we did find a trend, and it was strong. No, that's another, sorry. But we did find a trend for people to have less fatigue endurance after they watch somebody else get tired. So we're going to build on that because, like I said, we only collected 4 or 5 people, and we've got to get like 15 or 20 more people to really find some significant results. But if you're sitting on the bench and you're watching your team and they're playing horribly, will that affect the way that you play? Maybe you shouldn't be watching your team play if they're playing like crap. Yeah. Right? So, or maybe you shouldn't watch a sad movie before you go on the court.
Yeah.
So this psychophysiological area, I think, is a real big area that should be pounced upon in the future.
Yeah, it reminds me of a part in your book, actually, where you talked about how people did, I think it was 2 times 20-minute stretching sessions and 2 times 20-minute mindfulness practice sessions. And the people who did the mindfulness practice sessions improved their range of motion better than the actual stretching sessions. Do you think that's something similar to what you've just discussed?
Yes, absolutely. Because again, we go back to, if you can do mindful sessions, increase your parasympathetic response, make everything relax, you're going to be able to stretch farther than if you're tight and anxious and the muscles have a high degree of stiffness.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's really, really fascinating stuff. But that's it for my questions. So, Dave, thank you so much for your time. I know this interview is going to be a huge hit with the listeners of the podcast. So, yeah, thank you so much for your time. Really, really helpful.
My pleasure. I appreciate you inviting me.
Yeah, no problem at all. I'll see you later.
All right.
All right, bye-bye.